I'm Jonathan Horn.
I'm Cody Atkinson.
I'm Matteo Schlapek-Civillo, and this is 110 Percenters. On this week's show, we discuss Gold Coast inheriting the Crisis Club baton, the AFL Hall of Fame's newest inductees, and we shoot from the hip. Hello, and welcome to 110 Percenters, the footy podcast. My name is Matteo Schlapek-Civillo. I write the 1 Percenters newsletter. I'm joined by Cody Atkinson of the ABC. Cody, how are you, mate?
Yeah, not too bad, Matteo. How you doing?
I'm really, really well. As I was discussing with you guys, we filed the paperwork to adopt another cat over the weekend, which is pretty fabulous. And we also bought a new TV.
Hey,
Just in
bigger
time.
or smaller than your last TV?
Bigger, almost impossibly large. I said to my wife that I cannot picture, nor do I want to ever have a bigger TV than the one we got on Saturday. But hey, just in time for the World Cup. We're also joined by Jonathan Horn of The Guardian. Jonathan, how are you, mate?
Hello, gentlemen. It sounds a lot more exciting than my week, I've got to say.
Speaking of this weekend, footy was forced to take a rare backseat as the Socceroos began their World Cup campaign with a win that instantly entered the Australian sporting pantheon. Despite that, games of footy were played and narratives were forged. Round 14. How are we already up to round 14? Well, round 15, really. Began on Thursday night at Marvel Stadium, where the Adelaide Crows, helped by one of the most destructive first quarters of footy you're likely to see, trounced the Western Bulldogs. On Friday night, Geelong comfortably dispatched the Gold Coast Suns. More on that game and on the Suns in a moment. Saturday saw Melbourne defeat Essendon, North hang on just against West Coast, and Sydney come from behind in a cracker against Port at the Adelaide Oval. And on Sunday, when most of the nation's attention was elsewhere, Brisbane took its time against the competitive Richmond side, and St Kilda beat the Giants at Marvel. But we begin on the Gold Coast. The Suns won their first 3 games of the season by 56, 59 and 68 points. New recruit Christian Petrarca was best field in all 3 games. It looked like the Suns had finally risen to become true premiership contenders, with an ominous crop of academy talent still waiting in the wings. Since then, however, they've won just 4 out of their 10 games. They suddenly look middling. And now, after a third straight defeat, there's talk of tension between the coaching staff and the players, which may lead to the departures of, well, maybe players, maybe coaches. We'll see. There is discontent at Carrara. Jonathan, I think the place to begin is with the comments that Damien Hardwick made in his testy press conference after Friday's game at GMHBA, where he compared the home crowd to a Roman emperor at the Colosseum. It felt like an example of how Hardwick's job is very different to his previous coaching job. Tell us, what is different, both as a club and a team, from what Hardwick has to work with at Gold Coast compared to what he had at Richmond?
So many things are different. First to the team part of the equation. And it's you look at what he has now at the Gold Coast, and it makes you reflect on what he had at Richmond and why they were good and the things that sort of differentiated them in a way, and that very much are different to what he has at the Gold Coast. What he had there, he had players who were prepared to do the dirty work at Richmond. He had so many players who had, for want of a better term, sort of role discipline, who would do the heavy lifting for those 4 or 5 champion players that he had at Richmond. And I just don't think that he has those players at the Suns yet. And they're not the sort of players that you can just sort of snap your finger and they sort of just adapt into their role. And you see it this year when things go wrong, when Rao gets injured in the State of Origin game, when Witts is suddenly market corrected by the new ruck rules, when Anderson, maybe his output dips a little. That's when you start relying on these guys on the next rung down. And I think he's finding at the Gold Coast that the next rung down is very rickety and that they're not holding up their end of the bargain. The way those players did at Richmond, the guys like Kane Lambert, Jack Graham, Castagna. I can never pronounce his name. Jason Castagna. Apologies.
Jason C.
Jason C. Who just those players were so important to that Richmond team, and he doesn't have players like that at Gold Coast. And I think that that's leading to a lot of his frustration, and that's leading to this sort of the system breaking down at the Gold Coast, which we're seeing. And suddenly we're seeing this team that are pointing fingers and blaming, and suddenly we get a lot of leaking in the media, and suddenly they lose 3 games in a row, and it seems it's all going to shit.
Cody, let's dig into that a little bit deeper. Statistically, a lot of the problems for Gold Coast, I think, are related to what's happening to them at stoppage and stoppage chains. It was a strength of theirs last season. It's turned into a liability. So far in 2026, they're minus 93 for clearance differential. They were plus 77 in that same stat last year, and kind of scores from clearance. Given the weekend's game, they're now negative for scores from clearance differential this season. Do you think that's evidence of what Jonathan was just saying about maybe not enough grafters, not enough of those disciplined role players, too many stars, or maybe too many players who kind of want to be the star perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how Hardwick said at the start of his Gold Coast career that every club should be contending for finals and premierships every year. And then we think back to Richmond. It took 4 years to make finals the first time, breaking an 11-year drought. It took, 8-9 years to win that flag in 2017 after 2009, his appointment. The philosophy has changed, and I think this is where a lot of second coaches get to, is there's an urgency to be good and competitive soon. He's remade the Suns in his own image. When he took over, Dew was leading a very, very different footy team in a very, very different way, and it didn't work for the first year. It clicked for the second. And I think because the way that they've recruited and who they've recruited for, and the amount of talent that they've got on the books there's not enough consideration for the roles being filled, the right roles being filled, versus the players that they've got at their disposal. I think I was pretty critical, or somewhat critical, at the start of the year about Petrarca going to the Suns, just because they've got Bailey Humphrey, who's the same guy, and Miller can do some of the same things. There's a lot of duplication there. So you were talking about hard grafters. Sean Grigg, premiership winning ruckman. Sean Grigg, 3-time premiership winning ruckman, who's his assistant coach there. Sean Grigg did a lot of that hard work. Edwards did a lot of the hard work. Everyone pitched in at the Tigers, and every player has strengths and weaknesses, and most players are willing to be a bit malleable. But ultimately, you can fit a square peg into a round hole, but you're going to lose a lot of the brilliance of that square in the process. You know what I mean?
Something that always struck me about Hardwick's Richmond side at their best was, although it of course wasn't what made these players great, even the stars put in out of possession, and I think they played important roles. I mean, Cochin is, obviously he wasn't the brightest star on that team, and he was kind of an unusual superstar in some respect, but he obviously put in great defensive shifts. Cody, something that you've spoken about before is that Dustin Martin was actually often a sort of value add guy out of possession, I think, you know, by all means, go into that a little bit more if you like, but that does certainly seem to be lacking so far at the Gold Coast. Something I think when I look at them play, and look, hindsight, you know, Monday morning list managing is easy, right? There are, I guess, people who do it, but I think about how well a player like Malcolm Rosas has fit in at Sydney, and okay, there may not have been a list spot for him. That there was some talk, perhaps, that there was, you know, the occasional off-field issue. But I look at that type of player, a kind of almost quite pure small forward that plays an important connective role, you know, excellent sort of high equity in possession. And that looks like almost precisely the sort of player that Gold Coast are missing, because when I think about them in possession and the sort of what's preventing them from really being in that top echelon of teams, I think inside 50 connection feels like one of the big problems. They were an okay side when it came to inside 50 retention last season. They're a bad team at it this year. They're 15th at the moment for inside 50 retention. It feels like they run quite a almost high risk scheme, because so much of it depends on manufacturing space for Ben King. And we know, to sort of return to the subject, that he is rather limited in his contributions out of possession. So again, it's almost like out of possession, you're sort of playing with 17, and you're looking for ways to make Ben King work in that system. I guess what I'm saying is, this is, I think, a sort of list architecture problem at the moment. And when you've got players like, we mentioned Humphrey, right? He's been pushed out of the midfield there now. All of a sudden is a lot of talk about his future. Rogers, Lombard, these really, really highly touted academy prospects. A lot of them are sort of serving these apprenticeships in the forward line, and their roles feel quite indistinct to me a lot of the time. Like they're talented players, and so you want to play them.
They're not ready, and like they're clearly going to be good players. And he also shifts them around a lot. Like you look at Gold Coast play, and every week it's sort of a completely different mix that he always sort of sticks Ben King there. But then, around that, there's just so much sort of flux. And like you said before, just a core group of players who maybe are 1 or 2 years off. But at Richmond, he had that patience, and he had a club that had patience that he could get that right. I'm not sure he has that at the Gold Coast when there's so many of these young guys are angling to get out of the place and they're leaking and there's clear unrest that they're up there at the moment.
You guys have heard enough coaches talk and talk to enough coaches to know that one of the things that they preach the most is continuity, right? Having a core, clear group with an idea of what they need to do on the field. So I think Petrarca, Humphrey were meant to be a Dustin Martin replacement. Martin used to start centre square or stoppage, float forward, cause a mismatch or a switch. Both are very good one-on-one players like Martin was. I think he's trying to use King a bit like they used Tom Lynch for sort of that vertical spacing to space out the forward line, right? And I think King's a much more talented player in some respects than Lynch is. He's taller. You can use him a bit more up the ground. And you look at his numbers, they've declined under to Hardwick. His goals have gone up, but the rest of the contribution has gone down. And I think he's still looking for that. He's got the most talented list in the league, in my view. I mean, some of those guys are still a few years away, but
he's got. I mean, and it never works out like this because Richmond, you could never sum up Richmond in this way. But it's worth reminding everyone that he's got 12 top 10 draft picks in this team, and half of those were top 3 picks. He's got a Brownlow medalist, he's got a Norm Smith medalist, he's got the current leader of the Coleman medal. And yet they're still in this sort of sense of drift, and it comes back to that old thing of, well, what actually is a talented player? Would you rather have a Jack Graham and a Kane Lambert, or would you want some highly touted draft pick who's only known how to attack and be the center of play his entire career?
Maybe there's a world where we're having this same discussion in 2016 about Hardwick at Richmond, and we're talking about how it's shown flashes of promise, but it hasn't come together. And, notoriously, I guess, at the end of 2016, there was so much conjecture about whether Hardwick would be retained as Richmond coach. The club kind of publicly admitted that the rebuild hadn't really worked. It was obviously a long and painful one. So, of course, this conversation that we're having now is a snapshot in time. We're talking about a very, very talented list, and I think everyone acknowledges that it is stacked. And so I think part of the problem is just a bit of a sort of growth curve issue, and that we can see that there are 20-year-olds and 18-year-olds on that list who will be very good AFL players, but just aren't yet, partly because they're not physically mature. I think that's maybe part of the problem. But I think that, as you were saying earlier, Cody, right, I think Hardwick was very bullish when he came in. I mean, he talked about, 80% of the premiership list? 80% of the premiership list being there. And that was, a very attention-grabbing remark. And maybe that was part of what made him say that. But
shout out to Len.
Shout out to Len, absolutely. Friend of the podcast. But right now, I don't know, it just seems like, you know what? I think actually Gold Coast's current situation reminds me of, and, I think most normal people don't use these exact words, right? But so many discussions on places like Big Footy and conversations about footy in the pub ultimately reduced to, is footy a weak link game or a strong link game? Are teams defined by their stars, their top 5, or are teams defined by their bottom 5? Gold Coast have the top 5, right? Your mileage may vary on someone like Ben King, but I don't think it can really vary on someone like Anderson or Petrarca, right? But the bottom five at the moment, partly because of that physical immaturity, it's hard to ask 19 and 20-year-old kids to play kind of physical, defensive off-ball roles. I think that's part of the problem. Maybe part of it is that kind of everyone wants to be a conductor or whatever. I think Gold Coast's plight at the moment suggests that there is something to this idea that footy is, well, at least at times or in certain scenarios, it is a weak link game.
And to me, as you say that's the difference between Richmond 2017 to 2020 is that he had total buy-in from all players. You look at the way they played and it's a style of play he's tried to replicate at the Gold Coast in some respects. But to do that, you have to have total buy-in from players who want to be at that club, who are prepared to get paid under the odds, who don't want to leave their home city. He doesn't have that at the Gold Coast. There's always these sort of suggestions in the background that everyone's sort of looking after their own sort of paddock at the moment, and I think that's to the detriment of what he's trying to actually do there.
I think there's also this thing, though, that at the time that the Tigers were playing the way that they did, which was pretty distinct to the rest of the competition, that was stylistic outliers that had that competitive advantage. They've now been outflanked by two teams that do it to a bigger extreme in the Pies, who won a flag, and the Giants, who probably weren't that far off it. And now what he's trying to do at the Suns it's not a game style that's been solved, but certainly it's counterable. And the list isn't as geared to pulling it off. And I'm not sure he has been as flexible as he was in those early days at Richmond. And maybe that's still to come. Maybe that's part of the reason he's frustrated so often. Maybe he hasn't identified the core of the guys. Maybe I agree with you, Matteo. Even if it's not a weak link, strong link sport, I think the strategic side of footy is often under-emphasised at the players. And this is my great example. Nick Dacos gets, 30 disposals a game? And there's about 600 disposals in a given game across both teams. So he gets the ball about 5% of the time. We don't place footy like that. In basketball, LeBron James, during his prime, got the ball every time down the floor. If it didn't touch his hands, it was because it was a fast break. Tom Brady always had the ball in his hands, but the best footy players often don't. And it's more like baseball in that respect, in construction. And I think getting back to your point, Jonathan, players are happy when you're winning. And there was an ex-footy player on TV that I saw a clip of online who said, there's always leaks when you're not winning. When you're winning, everyone's happy. Even if you're not in the team, you're happy. And I think that's just what we're seeing, is that they're not winning right now. And maybe they're...
Also on that, the Suns have lost their last 3 games. Their next 5. Hawthorn at home, Fremantle away, Collingwood at home, Adelaide away, the Dogs at home. I mean, it's tough to see them winning that many of those games on current form, Jonathan.
And just on that, I mean, he has been gifted some of the best draws a coach has ever been gifted in his time at the Suns. And for the first time, they've got what looks like a really, really nasty few months. They've had a cosy run for the last 3 years or so.
It is fascinating to see where things end up. Will we have egg on our faces, listeners? I suppose. Yeah, Cody.
Can I pose one question to both of you guys? And Please. This is why I thought Hardwick might have been appointed. Do you think the Suns are more credible now than when he took over? Do you think they're more of a legitimate force? Because I think that was a question there. Matteo?
I think definitely. I think he drove improvement pretty much from day one. I think last year they were, a pretty serious side. They've regressed when I expected they would improve again. But I think also just because Hardwick is such a kind of proper football man, and I don't know, I think maybe Dew wasn't quite taken seriously by a lot of the rest of the competition. I think Hardwick has given that legitimacy just because of who he is and his track record, and, he's sort of taken her prisoner's rhetoric and that sort of stuff. So I would say yes.
Do you take them more seriously, Jonathan?
I'm not sure I take them more seriously as a club. I think I do take them more seriously as a team. And I think that that's another discussion about what actually the Gold Coast is. Is it a football club? Is it a franchise? Is it a sort of stab in the dark at what they're trying to do? Look, I actually am a bit more pessimistic about them. I think they're going to lose some key players. And I think there's just this cycle at the Gold Coast. They're going to have to almost like go through this again. If they lose Rao and they lose King and they lose Humphrey, I think that, I think that's a sign that things have gone amiss.
Humphrey's the one, right? He's the one with the untapped potential. If you lose King, you can talk yourself into Walter plus whoever. That's why they let the Koshis go. If you lose Rao, you can talk yourself into Miller plus Anderson, maybe a more defensive option, maybe more
Yes.
Petrarca and Humphrey in there. You can talk your way around it. But if they lose Humphrey, he's the one that is the most Dusty-like player in the league, the most Dusty-like young player in the league for a long time. And that must hit at his Hardwick's identity, right?
Yeah, and he was so important in that final that they won against Fremantle last year. But he's also, he's a bit of a troubled soul, and he's sort of laid that out in the past really admirably. But he's clearly got a strong connection with the coach as well. The coach loves him, but he just won't let him go. So there's that sort of paradox there.
It will feel like I think it will be a different category of error if the Suns lose Humphrey as opposed to the guys they were losing back to Victoria 10 years ago. Because, okay, we know that there were whispers that perhaps Humphrey was interested in seeking a move last year, but he's contracted for a long, long time. But as you said, Cody, I mean, Gold Coast prized off-season recruit is who Bailey Humphrey will probably be in 7 years. So it's interesting the way that Petrarca has really just taken his spot in the team. And now Bailey Humphrey, and okay, I think a reasonable person might say that a player with the talent of Humphrey finds a way to sort of engineer value and contribute despite being in a bit of a graveyard role. But it's clearly not a natural role for him. He's been shunted entirely out of the midfield in a year where you would expect this is what he was drafted in 2022. So let me try and do some maths on the fly. What is it, his 4th year now? You'd kind of expect his midfield time to have really increased if he were on a more normal growth curve. Instead, it's cratered, really. He's just not seeing meaningful midfield time at all. So you can kind of understand the frustration that he appears to be feeling.
Do they make finals this year, just in one word?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they will too, but that's almost just not enough
Yeah.
for what he has at his disposal.
Yeah, I think I agree on all counts, but I think they're actually in more doubt than I thought coming into the year, significantly more doubt.
Yeah, I think I had them pegged as a very decent chance for top 4, which perhaps says something about my level of ball knowledge more than it does the reality of
I
things.
had him second in the when I look up the Squiggle ratings, Squiggle's ladder that he has. Had him second, so way off there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, talent-wise, it's there, and you'd think normally just something's happened there.
Certainly one to watch. We'll wrap that segment up right there. We're going to be back talking about the AFL Hall of Fame.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
Welcome back to 110 Percenters with Cody Atkinson, Jonathan Horn, and me, Matteo Schlapeck-Savillo. Last week, the Australian Football Hall of Fame inducted 6 new members: Gary Ablett Jr., Tim Evans, Dustin Fletcher, David Cantilla, now sadly deceased, John Worsfold, and Hayden Kennedy, and elevated Bill Walker, the only man to have ever won 4 Sandover medals, to legend status. We're going to talk about those men and their contributions to the game and discuss the status and purpose of the Hall of Fame in 2026. Cody, I want to begin with you. Before we discuss the higher profile inductees, or this year's inductees, let's talk a little about the two who younger listeners and younger co-hosts might know a little less about, David Cantilla and Tim Evans.
Yeah, look, I think both of their inductions were probably long overdue. Well, Tim Evans was an inaugural member of the South Australian Football Hall of Fame, and David Cantilla, many cited him as one of the finest footballers from the Northern Territory, and he got to play his trade at South Adelaide. I think their inductions should typify what the Australian Football Hall of Fame is, and I think we're in a long journey back to recognising both earlier generations and non-Victorians. I'll speak about Cantilla a tiny bit more. Born Bathurst Island, he was a captain coach of St Mary's, and I'm pretty sure they won a flag when he did it. Played interstate football for both South Australia and I believe the NT. super athletic ruckman. He's the type of person that tells part of the story of Australian football, that we often think that we have an image of how Australian football has been played, and it largely looks like how it's been played recently. But players all across the country of all different shapes, bodies, builds, backgrounds, they've contributed to what we know and what we love of the game. And Cantilla is amongst them. And I haven't talked about Evans much, but I mean, Evans's reputation, both in South Australia and Tasmania, where he's also a Hall of Famer, has long been held in both those states and probably hasn't crossed over to the East Coast consciousness as much. Not many, I don't think, are 10-time leading goal kickers at Port, 6-time leading goal kickers in the Sandful, leading Port Adelaide, the most successful club in the country at the top level team for most goals all time. The fact that he wasn't in the Hall of Fame was a bit of a shock. So that's my take on that. No, I'm going to set myself up for some more stuff later. So I'll throw back to you.
Just before I throw to Jonathan, I do want to have a little sidebar and talk about. So I've been to the Tiwi Islands, and you know, it's important to sort of not over romanticize places like it. It's clearly got problems. It's also just a really remarkable slice of Australia, and they are absolutely footy mad. One of my favourite memories from my day on the Tiwi Islands was going to they've got a little footy museum up there, and just seeing the story of the Tiwi Bombers. That's the main club up there. So they play in red and black, and you know, obviously Tipper, Anthony McDonald, Tipper and Woody is a big hero up there. I visited in 2021, so it was, I believe it was after his first retirement, but maybe prior to his comeback in the AFL. I might have gotten that wrong. Apologies. So, and clearly it's made so many astonishing contributions to the canon of Aussie rules footy, Jonathan. You know, we talk about the Riolis, McDonald, Tipper and Woody, and David Cantilla is a name every bit the equal of those players, and so it's astonishing and yeah, overdue, I think.
And it's also one of the great things about Hall of Fame night is that, you know, we all think that we know everything about footy, and you know, I'm very Victorian centric, and we come from different states, but you get to learn about footballers you really didn't know a lot about, and that, even just watching his highlights on Hall of Fame night, he was astonishing, and I didn't know a single thing about his career, to my shame. But it's good because we get to learn about that, and footy, you know, we get to learn that footy just isn't all about the AFL.
Yes,
I think that's maybe where, and I'll hop in here with my bigger point, guys. I think that's maybe one of the detriments to the Australian Football Hall of Fame is that there's not a more physical location, or there's not a better job of cohesively telling the story of Australian football through its most important individuals. I know we have longer form biographies now of the inductees, but I don't think the stories are interwoven correctly or adequately to be able to tell the narrative of how footy has evolved and shaped itself, and how these absolutely astonishing figures have shaped parts of the way the games was played in different parts of the country. Because I still learn every week. Jonathan he keeps reminding us he's slightly older than the rest of us. He's not as much older as he thinks he is, but like, he's still learning, guys. And Matteo is almost certainly the same. And I'd like to think that we read and talk and research the game a fair bit. And if we're still learning stuff, that means that there's got to be a missing barrier there. And whether that's a physical location or a better job of coherent narrative telling, I don't know what.
I think it's something cricket does really well compared to Aussie rules, and I think footy's getting a little bit better at it. But there is that gap because of the different state leagues, and even like a thing like, should a VFA player be inducted in? That's a whole separate argument. We certainly don't have time for that, but that's really interesting as well, that argument.
Well, and it's also a little bit of that Premier League effect, right? Where it's, to an extent, it's not that it's in the AFL's commercial interest to pretend that footy didn't exist before the AFL existed, but it sort of is. I mean, clearly they have a bias to the modern day, and you know, obviously, I suppose, you know, footy is what it is, and it's in many ways unrecognisable from the game that was being played 50 years ago or something like that. But But I think in addition to the sort of state league problem and the fact that, of course, footy states have their own halls of fame as well, so there's a little bit of it's not a jurisdictional problem, but there is commemoration that happens in those other states as well. I think it was a couple of weeks now the Adelaide Football Club had its sort of Hall of Fame, induction for 2026. But I think that, I think certainly the top level of the game could be better at commemorating its history. Jonathan, Gary Ablett Jr., I think probably it's fair to say, headed the list of recently retired players who were inducted. He made reference to his father in his speech, and I do want to talk about his father and his father as a player you have spoken and written really beautifully about. But before we do that, let's talk about the son. Let's talk about Gary Ablett Jr. Let's talk about your recollections of him, the player, as a journalist, as a writer, and I don't know if this is a peek behind the veil that I'm allowed to do, but as a Geelong man.
He's a very neutral Geelong man. Gary Ablett Jr., I would say, he's certainly what sort of hits home with Gary Jr. is it takes a night like that just to get a full appreciation of his sort of honour board of what he did. And you sort of forget that because there was always just sort of so much peripheral stuff going on about, will he go to Gold Coast? Will he come back to Geelong? All that. But you just look at his list of achievements on paper, and I honestly don't think there's a footballer who can top that's ever played the game in terms of just how he's certainly the most consistent footballer I've ever seen. I've never seen someone with a more consistent output, but also just look, to be perfectly honest, I don't think that Gary is looked at, and I could differ to other Geelong people on this. I think there's other Geelong footballers who are sort of more fondly remembered for their exploits on the field than Gary Jr. There was always that sense, when he went to the Gold Coast, that, other players like Selwood are more fondly sort of remembered by the supporter base.
The Ablett's choice to leave had sort of forfeited a little bit of that legacy, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. And he was also, his critics would say, and I don't agree with this, but that he was always just playing for his stat sheets, playing to get those 40 possessions, and that there were other footballers who in sort of specific moments that you would rely on more than Gary Jr. I don't agree with that, but he would definitely be in the top 5 players I've ever seen. He'd be the first rover, although Kevin Bartlett would be very unlucky in that discussion. The first rover in any team selected, and just gave a lovely speech the other night, and just a phenomenal footballer.
Cody, part of Gary Ablett Jr.'s career was played in almost a sort of slightly still pre-modern era when it came to analytics, and now, of course, there's so much that we know about evaluating player performance, at least in certain ways, rating points, and kind of slightly more advanced stats. But I think certainly his peak still suggested that, in addition to all of the plaudits and the honours that Jonathan's described, statistically he was a bit of a one-of-one player, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think offensively, with the ball in hand, there's few that have had more talent and, not only getting his own, but making his team better. And that's where I have a criticism with his just filling up the stat sheet. I don't think there was many empty carbs there with Gary Ablett. And I think that was part of that was how he developed as a player he was relatively underrated coming into the league, even though he was the son of God. You can be the son of God and still go through the hard craft of being a small forward who had to get his impact in a very limited amount of time on ball. And everything from that point on was about making sure that his impact was valued, not loose handball receives, not trying to bite off too much or too little, doing the right thing at the right time. And even at the Suns, he I reckon when he played, he made those teams better. There was the year 2015, I think it was, won the Brownlow, missed the last 7 games. They fell out of finals contention. I still think that changes the trajectory of that club, and his stay at the club was that injury. And I think
he was arguably a better player at the Suns. I reckon his
absolutely.
output before that shoulder injury, considering, that he really didn't have a lot of help there. And just the state of that club, the state of their facilities, and just what sort of club his ability to sort of just maintain and probably excel on what he'd produced at Geelong is almost the most incredible thing about his career.
I think it's an important discussion, and I think it's one that we're really well placed to have. I alluded to it a little bit earlier. Gary Ablett Jr. did mention his father in his acceptance speech, and it was actually a really touching part of the speech. I think Gary Ablett Sr., of course, as we all know, is one of the best players to ever play the game. He was inducted into the AFL Hall of Fame in 2005, and how could he not be, given what he did on field? But he hasn't been elevated to legend status, and I think it's probably worth touching on that a little bit. Jonathan, I suppose Ablett Sr. is maybe the most iconic example, but not the only example of this issue that perhaps the Hall of Fame or maybe the broader league seems to be grappling with about absolutely outstanding players whose on-field contributions merit the highest of acclaim, but whose off-field issues, I suppose, problems have maybe prevented, or for the time being have prevented, their elevation to legend status.
Yeah, and I think I said last week that he's the best player that I've seen. Probably not the most valuable player I've seen, if you can sort of separate those two concepts. But he's definitely, as a kid, he gave me more joy than any other athlete I've ever seen watching sport. But the fact is that he's proved himself to be a pretty shit human being over the years on many measures. And, for that very reason, I think there's something noble about the Australian Hall of Fame saying, well, no, you're of insufficient character to be in this, to be elevated to a legend. And you can, in that sort of, with that sort of criteria, you compare it to, say, let's compare it to, what are some other sports? Say the Boxing Hall of Fame.
Sure.
Where, Don King is in the Boxing Hall of Fame. I think Sonny Liston's in the Boxing Hall of Fame.
One imagines that something like the NFL Hall of Fame might have some less salubrious characters in it as well, right?
Absolutely, and it's I wrote down something that Patrick Smith, the late Patrick Smith, wrote years ago when he used to write a lot about Hall of Fame inductees. His quote was, "If rat bags and loose cannons were to be excluded from the Hall of Fame, there'd be no one to judge it, no one to enter it, and no one to write about it." Now, that's very true, but, the word rat bag and loose cannon, we're talking beyond that in terms of the complexity of some of the men who have who are still to be elevated to legends. And in the case of a Barry Cable, someone who was, I guess, demoted from his position as a legend in the Hall of Fame because of the civil case that took place in Western Australia. So to get back to my point, I think, there is something noble about that we are excluding someone like Gary Ablett Sr. I think that's important, and I think it's I actually think it would be an easy decision for them to make. I think a harder decision for the panelists is obviously going to be around Wayne Carey, and that's something they're going to have to grapple with, I guess, in the next couple of years, is what to do with Wayne Carey. I think that's a far more difficult decision to make than it would be for Gary Ablett Sr.
You raised the example of American Football Hall of Fame. I don't know if you guys
are you going to steal the quote that I was about to? I guess we'll see.
Well, Jim Tyra. Do you guys know about Jim Tyra?
No.
Jim Tyra was offensive tackle, played for the Kansas City Chiefs, Super Bowl champion, 8-time AFL All-Star, multiple-time Pro Bowler, arguably the greatest offensive tackle of that era in one of the best teams. Was nominated for the Pro Football Hall of Fame at the time of his death. In his first year of eligibility, was considered a slam dunk. Now, I mentioned the time of his death. He was involved in a murder-suicide, as the murder side killed his family. He became a nominee for the Pro Football Hall of Fame for the first time in 44 years this year. And it caused a lot of controversy in the US about the morality clause and whether we should be able to separate, say, the art from the artist is the classic term. Can we listen to the music of, say, Michael Jackson or P. Diddy or a lot of these different people? And he's the footballing sort of Rorsch test on that degree. And he was a finalist, and there was a belief that he had CTE at the time of his death, and there was a documentary that reopened this case, and that was the push for his nomination. And ultimately, he fell short. He's only one of two eligible players with at least 6 All-Pro selections not be a member of the Hall of Fame, and that's still the case. And it'll be interesting to see where the Australian Football Hall of Fame goes, not just with the legend status, but like sort of where it draws the line, because every Hall of Fame has a line, just where that is.
The NFL anecdote that I was going to introduce, and thank you for that, Cody. That was really interesting, and I didn't know about it. And it turns out it wasn't what I was going to say. There's a quote attributed to the former Arizona Cardinals general manager, Steve Keim, who was supposed to have said, if Hannibal Lecter ran a 4.3, referring to a 40-yard dash time, we'd probably diagnose it as an eating disorder. So very, very funny, very pithy, right? So I like that quote because it actually serves two purposes. It explains club behavior. Clubs are not in the business of being moral custodians, moral arbiters. I don't think we should expect them to be. They're in the business of trying to win. The AFL has a different job. The AFL's job is not to win. I mean, I suppose it's to win in a broader sense of, outcompeting other sporting codes. But if there's any kind of participant in this funny old opera of footy that has a legitimate role as being some sort of moral guardian, is the AFL. So if anyone's going to draw that line, it should be the AFL. And it should be, the bar for admission into the AFL Hall of Fame, or particularly the legend status, I think should be extremely demanding on questions of, character, as well as on-field contributions.
Can we please get to something less depressing? Like, who do you think should be in the Hall of Fame next? Or
yeah, let's throw it open, Jonathan.
I see a lot of Sav Rocker online. I am not buying into Sav. No offense to the Rocker family; they're a wonderful family, but a couple more years for Sav for mine. The one I've always wanted to see in there is Brent Croswell, who sort of predated the Norm Smith medal, but all retrospective type analysis of those games in the 70s would say that he would have won 2 Norm Smith medals in 2 of the most famous grand finals of all. So I think he's pretty stiff, and he's also, I think, the best former footballer who's written about the game. And I think that sort of enhances his sort of credibility to get in there. I'd love to see him in there. I think Libba's a bit stiff. Tony Liberatore, maybe.
Yep.
Not sure if Libba won a club best and fairest, but I think his career stacks up compared to a few other recent additions in recent years. And shout out to friend of the podcast, Paul Amy, who's constantly campaigning for old VFA legends like Fred Cook to be put in. And look, I took a lot of convincing on that, but he mounts a really good argument, and it would sort of just bring something very different to the occasion.
Is this where I jump in, guys?
Is where you jump in, Cody.
Fantastic. I'll start at the start because I don't think the start of Australian football is adequately described in the Hall of Fame. Just one of the blokes who wrote the founding document, the first rules of the game, is inducted, Tom Wills. His cousin Harrison's also in there, but he probably wasn't there. He's a huge figure in the development of early football, and he's one of the reasons it sort of looks the way it does now, so he deserves a place. But the early journalists on the game, William Hammersley and JB Thompson, aren't in there. They were there to write the rules and shape the game. The game wouldn't exist without those two men, very likely. Thomas Smith also may have been there, and he certainly had a role in the early game. And they did it at the pub Parade Hotel, owned by James Bryant, who was the president of the MCC at the time, I believe, or an influential member. I think if you're having a Hall of Fame, you've kind of got to start at the start. It's the Naismith Memorial Hall of Fame in the US for basketball, and there's a lot of those historical things. Now, I'm going to start referring to people that were alive at some point in one of our lifetimes. Fred Fanning, Peter Box. Peter Box won the 54 Brownlow in the year that they won the flag. He's not in the Hall of Fame. He went to VFA and had a decent career there, and I think his career was shortened by a car accident from memory. Fred Fanning went to play country footy the pretty much the week after he kicked 18 goals in a VFL game and dominated there, kicking hundreds of goals every year. So, I mean, we've got Coleman's held in high regard, and I know the end of his career was different, but Fanning, I reckon, deserves a mention. I love Sav Rocca, so why not? I'm a big Hall. I think the Hall is too small. I think we could
Yes.
include a lot more. I think in the US, there's always a discussion about big Hall versus small Hall. We've got 18 players on a field at any given time. We had 4 or 5 elite leagues through most of the game's history, and most of the states are underrepresented. I reckon we need to have a broader inducting pool. I think there needs to be a lot more research into how we can tell the game better through a Hall of Fame.
It's funny because I think friend of the podcast, Lenny Phillips, is an advocate for Sav Rocca getting in, and he was teeing off about the fact that Dustin Fletcher got in. His theory being that Sav kicked half his goals on Dustin Fletcher, and about half of those came in an Anzac Day match. Look, how many goals did Sav kick? About 700?
Yeah.
It's pretty.
Yeah, I think it was
pretty good.
sevens-ish, yeah.
It's a good career on paper for sure.
The only player in the top 30 that is eligible for inclusion in the Hall of Fame that isn't in there.
I'll take back what I said earlier. If Barry Hall can get in, we're putting Sav in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? With the Cantilla stuff, I'll mention one other family. We can do a family, the Lou Fat family in the NT. Go away, look that up. Chinese indigenous family, pioneers of football, long recognised in the NT. Probably don't get the props south of Alice Springs.
Love that. I've just got 3 names for you, gentlemen. Ian Perry, Ken McGregor, Jason Porplesia. Get him in.
Jason Porplesia.
Porpoise.
Great player. Had his shoulder not popped
Induct
out.
him.
Had his shoulder not popped out every time there was a stiff breeze. Maybe he'd be in there.
You sounded like Gary Ayres just reeling off his list of players there.
Kidney was
Will
always,
Vincent, no.
Kidney always loved Gary Ayres' hair, actually. Very, very slick at his time at West Lakes. Look, as you can probably tell by that little note of levity, it is time to move on to another segment. Hopefully you found what you were looking for in our chat about the Hall of Fame. We're going to be right back.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
Welcome back to 110 Percenters, the footy podcast. It's time for From the Hip, our rapid fire question segment.
From the hip.
One host asks, 2 hosts answer. Cody, the first question is yours.
We got a reader's question in from David from Darwin. Where would you see Nestor Irukanda playing in the AFL? Inside midfielder, crafty small forward, or are we overthinking the whole soccer players as AFL stars thing?
Well, David from Darwin, thank you for that question. That's a very SEN question that David from Darwin's asking there. I remember at the last World Cup, they did a poll on who is our Messi, who is the AFL's Messi, and who is the AFL's Ronaldo. And for about 45 minutes, they've got all these maniacs ringing in and debating whether Connor Rosie is our version of Lionel Messi and so on. Anyway, so God help us. Look, I think he'd be handy in any team. I think Chris Scott would find a variety of roles for him, David. It's actually, or Ross Lyon might sort of deploy him in a back pocket or something. So who knows?
Sinclair style back pocket. I mean, he's got the running power.
He does.
Mystery.
He does. It's actually amazing that the AFL hasn't managed to insert itself in this World Cup as much as they have in previous World Cups.
I was just going to say I was very amused by a social media post from the AFL account. It must have been on Monday, I suppose, that sort of put together a hypothetical best 11 of AFL players. And clearly this is all just fun and engagement bait and you know, all that. But the midfield 3, Nick Dacos, Christian Petrarca, and Marcus Bontempelli. And I've just got to say, obviously all brilliant players, but Cody, that team is just getting wrecked in defensive transition. Any decent counter-attacking
team.
team.
Stereotyping like a Nick Giannopoulos, Wogboy style midfield? Is that racial profiling?
Well, Josh Rochelli was the left winger in that. He at least played soccer. He was in the Melbourne City.
Isaac
Youth
Heaney
Academy.
wasn't the left wing. No,
He was on the other wing.
I think, well, the one that shocked me with that one is Mason Cox played, I think, college soccer in the US. It's certainly high-level high school soccer, and he was omitted from the team as a goalkeeper. Surely Mason Cox standing on his side would block any goal better than Patrick Beach.
Well, yeah. Well, they had the AFL account had Sam Draper in, and again, I suppose he did play soccer. Jonathan, next question, I believe, is yours.
It is. Gentlemen, should umpires and journalists be inducted into the Australian Hall of Fame?
I'm going to take this one. I'm going to say yes. And in addition, I think podcasters should be eligible for the Hall of Fame. I think Substack authors should be eligible for the Hall of Fame. I think Guardian writers should be eligible for the Footy Hall of Fame. And I think ABC contributors should be eligible as well. We all contribute in our own way.
Yeah, I think, you know me, broad haul, but I think you're right. I think banner riders long overlooked. I think the people that clap politely in the third quarter without looking too much at their thermoses, I think they've long been overlooked in the Hall of Fame.
What about the footy social media account managers who sort of develop a personality beyond their job? Do you think they should be eligible for the Hall of Fame as well, Cody?
Look, no comment, but no comment.
Craig Hutchinson actually made a vaguely interesting point about this on his podcast today. He said, why isn't Mike Brady in the Hall of Fame? And you sort of, at first you think, oh, you've got to be kidding me. And then you have a think about it, and it actually makes sense.
Yeah.
So if Mike Brady makes it, I have to advocate for my one-time bandmate Nick Kraft, who wrote It's a Draw. And if he makes the Hall of Fame, then I've been in the same band as the guy who's, you know.
He'll give you a shout out.
1 degree of separation from the Footy Hall of Fame, Cody. That would be a feather in your cap.
Let's make it happen.
The final question is mine, and Cody, it's nominally for you, but the floor is open for everyone. A question from Andrew Charlton. No, not that one, via email. Everyone can name right-footed players who can kick just as well on their left, but can you name a naturally left-footed player who could kick just as well on their right?
I'll steal the obvious one. Sam Mitchell, ambidextrous. One of the reasons he was overlooked in the draft was maybe lacking some of the physical skills, so he put a lot of time and effort into learning how to kick with his right as well, if not better, than his left. But I think a lot of players these days get told to work around to their preferred foot, and you see Nick Dacos's little stab kick on the outside of the foot. Goulden does it too. A lot of players do it just because there's this idea that taking an extra step or two to get on the right side is more effective usually than using your wrong foot, unless you're a small forward.
Yeah, we'll include that Instagram clip, which is what you're referring to there, Cody, in the show notes, because I thought it was really interesting because it was talking about that fact that, when you're sort of growing up playing footy, and Jonathan, you can speak to this as well, certainly much more of a footy player than me. I think, more of a footy player than either of us. You're brought up and told, learn how to kick on your non-preferred. It's one of the most important things you can do. But it does actually seem as though maybe the meta is shifting a little bit toward players. Well, not that being ambidextrous is not an asset, but that actually the better value is found in just really perfecting that outside of the dominant foot kick and the angles that can open up.
I always thought it was just a huge advantage to be a left footer in footy, because everyone from the time you start playing.
So did Alec Clarkson.
Well, exactly. Every time from the time you start playing as an 8 or 9-year-old goes to tackle you on the right side of your body, and left footers just always seem to have that little bit more time, and for some reason they always have a beautiful technique. I'm not quite sure how that works out. But
were you a lefty too, Jonathan?
The only thing I do left-handed is eat. Believe it or not, I hold my knife and fork in the sort of wrong way round. So
same.
No, I wasn't. If you to look at me,
it's weird, but I'm exactly the same, man.
Really? Oh, I was going to say that makes Jonathan our resident Rafa Nadal. Rafa famously right-handed, but Uncle Tony, told him to play tennis left-handed because it would be such an advantage with his style against right-handed players on the backhand side, because he could just rip that top spin lefty forehand high into the backhand corner.
Did not know that.
There you go. But it turns out that you're both Cody and Jonathan, you're both our resident Raphael Nadals. That's great. I'm boringly normal. I mean, I could barely kick a footy, but yeah, certainly not on my left. I think that probably wraps us up for From the Hip this week. We are going to come back and wrap up the show on the other side of a small break.
You're listening to the 110 Percenters.
That just about is all we have time for this week. Let's very, very quickly go around the grounds and have a bit of a chat about what we're working on this week, or I guess, Cody, in your case, maybe what you have recently published.
Yeah, look, I'll start with my clutch time, crunch time piece. Worked on it for a fair bit, but I think for the first time I've seen breaking down what teams do when they're leading in late games up by very little versus when they're chasing. So would recommend, please read it. Other than that, I've been watching a lot of the World Cup and a lot of sport. Cabo Verde with the low block, and Matteo can probably talk about the low block a bit more. Did an Australia-esque performance to get a point from Spain. We don't always have to be just AFL obsessed here, so it's good to maybe watch another sport every now and again.
Can I very quickly introduce an anecdote that I think has probably been done to death on every soccer podcast that I listen to, but I've not yet heard on a footy podcast, partly because I don't listen to footy podcasts. There's a central defender for Cabo Verde / Cape Verde who, I think I've got this right. Yeah. Anyway, he was born in Dublin, has grown up in Ireland, plays in the League of Ireland. I think his father was Cape Verdean, was a cook on a cruise ship that docked in Dublin, had a relationship with his mother, and he was, the product of it. In, I think it was 2018, got a LinkedIn message in Portuguese by someone attempting to recruit him to play for the Cape Verde national football side. And he just ignored it because he thought it was spam. And then a year later, they wrote back to him in English this time, and he saw it, thought, oh, hang on. Yeah, all right. And so he's been playing for Cape Verde since 2019. And overnight, he contributed to a side's first ever World Cup game and clean sheet against Spain, the European champions, and maybe the favourites for the entire tournament. Pretty cool.
Wow. Whoever said LinkedIn is a crock of shit? Amazing.
Just 99% of the world's population. Jonathan, please tell the good people what you're working on.
Yeah, so we sort of talked about some of it before with Hardwick, but I'm doing a piece that'll come out later on Wednesday on Hardwick and again what we were sort of discussing today, that difference between what he had at Richmond and what he doesn't have now at the Sun.
It's nice when you can farm the podcast for bits for the piece.
This is it. I've got a few late additions now. You guys have.
It's just a great loop. It's a great loop. Yeah, it's a great loop that we're building here. I'm taking
What are you doing? Yeah.
I'm taking a little bit of a week off from the newsletter. Just I published a long piece about St Kilda and Collingwood standing at the crossroads last week and sort of, whether they should kind of stick or twist in their list management approaches. I also ran through a lot of clips because it'd been a while since I did that and I was feeling a bit itchy. However, I am continuing with my mid-season report card series on the Substack. So this Monday, I put out a piece that covered Carlton, Collingwood, Freo and Hawthorn, the four sides who set out round 14. Big thanks to all the people who helped me with that one. If you're unfamiliar with the format, basically I ask a supporter of that side to share their thoughts with me about how the first half of the season has gone, and then I kind of respond with my own thoughts, often sort of building off of that. A little bit of a sort of salon series is the end, is the goal.
Shout out to all of those writers, and especially to Jono at Carlton, who's sort of ridden the roller coaster of the Voss era and been a really sort of measured voice on what's going on at Carlton in the last few years.
Yeah, shout out to Jono, shout out to Nat, to Mim and to Lee as well. Really, really wonderful kind of footy Substack and just in general sort of independent footy writing community that's springing up, and it's really, really great to see. I think it's all from us this week. It's been an action-packed show. Big thanks to Jonathan Cody, of course, and our hearty thanks to you, listener. If you like what you're hearing, please review the show on your podcast platform of choice. It makes the show easy to find. And even if you're not loving it, which is totally fine, as long as it's constructive, we do want to hear from you. You can write to me at hello@1percenters.net.au, and you can find each of us on Twitter. I think we probably all, apart from you, maybe Jonathan, probably all spend a little bit too much time on Twitter, but so you can find us
You'd
there.
be surprised.
I post each episode of the show to my Substack, and you can also share your thoughts in the comments section there. Until next week, I've been Matteo.
I've been Jonathan.
And I've been Cody.
And we're the 110%ers.